Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Government. It's great to see you all here today. My name's Hannah White. I'm Deputy Director here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this event on what the aid watchdog can tell us about how to spend public money well. So that's a fairly self-explanatory title, I think. But as we all know, spending of aid money is not an uncontroversial topic. And we at the IFG think that this question about how government can ensure that money is spent well is a really important one. So we're really pleased to have this opportunity to discuss the role of ICAI, how it fits, and what its sort of utility is as a wider model, really, for how government can think about the effectiveness of spending. And it's particularly interesting that we're talking about this in the context of the work that the Commons Procedure Committee has been doing on whether there's a need for a wider budget committee that might perform a similar sort of role across the whole of public spending. So, really delighted to have here today Tamsyn Barton, who's the new Chief Commissioner of ICAI, and she's going to talk about the recent synthesis review of ICAI for the next 4 years and what hold and her views on the model. And then, as I say, really delighted to have a great panel to reflect on her comments and to talk about some of these issues. So, obviously, we have Rycroft, who's the Cabinet Secretary of DFID, Scully, who chairs the Parliamentary Subcommittee, which oversees ICAI, which is, in itself is an interesting model to have that subcommittee of a Commons committee to focus on this role. It's nice to have the chair of the IDC committee here today as well. And we have Martin Wheatley, who's a senior fellow here at IFG, and he's going to reflect a little bit on the wider implications of the ICAI model. So, no more ado, I will hand over to Tamsyn to take us through her thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm feeling absolutely delighted today. This is the best possible way we can start off phase 3, I think. I've got the outgoing commissioners at the back. Do you mind sticking up your hands, identifying yourselves? So you're not hiding, we want to hear from you. And I've got the incoming, I can see one. Can I see the other one? The incoming commissioners here as well. So let me go back a bit. So this is the beginning of the third commission. Let me take you back to the beginning of ICAI and explain how we came to be. We were set up in 2011, and it was in the context of the legislation committing the UK to provide 0.7% of its gross national income in aid. The idea was that, and this was in the legislation, that there needed to be robust and independent scrutiny of the aid programme, ultimately to improve it. For those of you who are sort of governmentology nerds, it's a non-departmental public body, specifically an advisory one, sponsored by DFID, but our independence is very much guaranteed through our reporting line through the subcommittee to the Select Committee on International Development. What do we actually do? Well, we produce evidence-based reports on UK aid, and of all programmes, regardless of where they sit. On the back of that evidence, we make recommendations, we communicate our findings, and very importantly, we follow up within the year to see whether the government has really responded to our work, and that report also goes to the committee. So, as Hannah mentioned, we've just done a review looking back over the last 4 years. I've actually only been here for the last 6 months of it, so it's why it's important that the outgoing commissioners are here. But I have spent time on that review. And I think it's worth saying a few things about it. I think, first of all, at the high level, given the controversy, as Hannah mentioned, about how aid is spent, it's worth noting that out of those reviews that were scored, there were 24 scored reviews, 2/3 scored satisfactory or better. The remaining 1/3 we felt had positive elements, but improvements were needed for the aid to make a positive contribution overall. So that's the high-level performance assessment, if you like. But in terms of specifics, I think it's worth highlighting, at first, some extremely positive contributions, on the whole, to the SDGs as a whole, but I would particularly highlight contributions to the inequality goal, leave no one behind, as it's known, and in this context, the work on violence against women and girls and social protection, which DFID has led. We've also seen positive examples of work across government, such as in the global health threats like Ebola. We also, of course, found room for improvement. First of all, in DFID's case, I would pick out ensuring attention to public services being sustainable, not just looking exclusively at immediate delivery results. Relationships with civil society organisations, and I think some of you are here and you'll doubtless have your thoughts on those. And proper attention in the case of multilateral channels to their normative role, which is something that came out of our review of humanitarian reform. However, I'd say on the whole that the larger challenges came with other government departments. We found that the scaling up of aid that had happened beyond DFID had been done before the necessary capabilities were in place, before there was proper monitoring, evaluation and learning. And we found in particular that there was insufficient attention to doing no harm in conflict settings. Having said that, when we went back to follow up, we found that improvements had happened. And this is very reassuring for our mission ultimately to improve aid. So I think the strongest example actually is if we look back over the longest time, and that the review that's had the longest impact was done in 2014 in phase 1, and that was on how DFID learns, although that's our view because we've heard a lot about it as we do our reviews in DFID, but wait to hear whether Matthew agrees with that. But looking at more recent ones that were in this year's report, which will be coming out soon, I would highlight disability. I think we've seen a good response to some of the demanding recommendations we had there. What we've also seen, I think, in relation to the cross-government, the non-DFID funds, is now proper attention to human rights risks, much better monitoring, evaluation and learning, and the introduction of coordination in relation to the research funds, all in response to our recommendations. So, looking ahead, taking on board the lessons from phase 2, I think at this point, I hope we find ourselves in a position of credibility with both the committee and our target departments. I wait to hear whether that's what they feel, but I realise that to maintain that, we need a constant and continuing focus on quality and rigour and independence. So we have to keep that, and I think there's been important developments in rigour and some innovations in phase 2. But of course, we need to have some new directions at the start of phase 3. And how we kicked that off is we went out in an online consultation as well as consulting lots of stakeholders. And that has given us some important new directions. As in general, we feel we need to improve the salience of our reviews, live issues which are of the most importance to the public and to our key stakeholders. And we need to communicate more about what we find. I think ICAI is still a well-kept secret. So I hope today is part of making sure that's no longer the case. So finally, looking forward, our plans are to expand our coverage of all aid spending departments. So we've kind of started with a bang there because we're looking in our first review how UK aid learns at all 18 departments. There was actually an additional department that appeared during the process of the review. So that's a good kick-off, we feel, for making sure we know something about all of them. We're going to have an increased focus, as we were taking our cue from the public consultation, on spending through multilateral channels. And thirdly, and by no means least, we want to ensure that the voices of the people who are actually meant to benefit from UK aid are heard through our reviews, better than in the past, and building on the best examples. So I hope that in itself will increase public trust. And I would argue that in this case where trust is reducing, we need more than ever independent, specialised scrutiny which improves aid. I think for us to be most effective, and today is a good opportunity to consider it, the work that ICAI has done, our evidence, should be fed in to the spending review or whatever allocation there is in future of aid. I think that would be the best way to get value out of ICAI. Thank you.
So I think we'll kick off with Matthew. How does this feel from DFID's point of view? What role does ICAI play? Has it helped DFID with? And what would your reflections be for ICAI as they go forward into their next period?
Thank you very much, Hannah, and the IG for inviting me along. Thank you all of you for coming, and great to hear Tamsyn's thoughts at 6 months into her role as head of this really important organisation, and I look forward to sharing a panel with Paul and Martin. So the short version of what I want to say is that of all the departments that I know, the Department of International Development is both the one that has the best track record at spending money in a value for money and impactful way, and the one that is under most scrutiny and oversight. And I think those two facts are related. So I welcome the oversight and scrutiny that comes from the ICAI and the rest of the architecture, which I'll set out in a sec, and look forward to it continuing. I think, if I may say so, that Richard and Tina, the outgoing commissioners, have done a sterling job, and look forward to working with their successors in the years ahead. So I mentioned that ICAI is just one part of the architecture. The other bits, which I think all help with that scrutiny, that oversight, are, it's a bit of a blizzard of acronyms, but I'll explain them. The IDC, the NAO and the PAC, and the DAC. The International Development Committee is the select committee, and every department has a select committee, but the International Development Committee is the one for the Department of International Development, and I think it's fair to say has a very strong track record of having members on it, leading it, who really know the subject extremely well. The NAO, the National Audit Office, and the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, scrutinise all public spending, including the aid budget, but all of the rest of public spending as well. And in fact, later I had my debut in this role in front of the Public Accounts Committee, looking at a National Audit Office report, largely about how other government departments spend their ODA, which I'm looking forward to, I think. And then the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, is the OECD committee that sits in Paris that sets the aid rules and works out whether any particular bit of spending counts as within the aid rules or not. So if you put all that together, that's actually, significantly more oversight and scrutiny than I think most other bits of public spending get, and that's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Well, I think for three reasons. First of all, the breadth of what we are seeking to do with the aid budget. I don't know if it was ever the case that there was a very narrow version of what we were seeking to do, but it's certainly not the case anymore. We are seeking to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of those and 169 targets, but they can be summarised with the 5 Ps of people, planet, prosperity, partnerships, all based on peace. So that's a very broad remit, and if anything, getting broader. There's also the scale of the spending. So successive governments and all main parties support the 0.7% commitment. It's now legislated for, so we anticipate that continuing indefinitely. So that is a proportion of our gross national income. So as long as our income goes up, that share of our income will also go up. So the amount of spending will continue to increase, albeit at a much lower rate than it was in the years where we got up to the 0.7. And then the third reason for the necessity to have this oversight is the sensitivity of some of the issues. And although the main parties all support the 0.7% commitment, I think it's fair to say there are plenty of people who vocally do not support that. And so through other types of scrutiny, including the media, there is a very high degree of oversight over anything that counts as the aid budget, and I warmly welcome that. I think when we look ahead, we will see that the combination of the upcoming spending round, and we have to have as a minimum a 1-year allocation for the next financial year by November. That plus Brexit plus political changes all mean that all of those things are going to continue to be in the public eye. So we need a strong, independent, expert, deeply expert ICAI to play its role in this architecture. The fun thing I wanted to say is that ICAI produces, I think, 9 reports approximately each year. There's a scoring system, sort of reds and ambers and greens, although in practice we seem either to get an amber red, bad news, or an amber green, good news. Not quite sure what about the rest of the scale. But the important point I want to make was that if it's an amber red, that is quite a significant alarm bell for me personally and for the department as a whole. And you wouldn't believe, actually probably some of you would believe, the amount of sort of scurrying that goes around in order to respond to that and really understand what are the ICAI trying to say to us on this? Why have we scored badly on this? Because if we thought we were doing badly, we would have changed it already, right? And there are lots of examples of us working out for ourselves with our own oversight and scrutiny processes, what isn't working and us stopping it. If we haven't, and we therefore get an amber red, that's a big deal. But we also learn from amber greens. And so when we get something that, as we did, I think, quite early on in our education and women and girls work, that is a very significant boost of confidence, which allows us to spread the word in a way that we otherwise wouldn't have done. So I'm all for it, and I look forward to having even more of it in the future.
So Paul, as a former baby clerk on the International Development Committee, when I started my career in Parliament, there was no such thing as ICAI, and there's no such thing as a subcommittee looking at being able to use that product. So it'd be really interesting to hear your reflections on what difference that makes, and as chair of that subcommittee, how you make use of ICAI's product, and what, if anything, you think they need to do differently going forward.
Sure, no, thank you very much, Hannah, and thanks very much for the IFG for hosting us today. Matthew, I thought you did brilliantly. I always get to the edge of my seat when he said about the 5 Ps. You didn't hesitate on fourth or fifth at all, so that was wonderful. So well done. When I joined the International Development Committee, AB chair by Stephen here, in I think about September 2016, and I wasn't anywhere near an expert in international development. It was an area that interested me, and especially post-Brexit, post-referendum, the international nature of that committee, working through with the wider themes of the Foreign Office and Department of International Trade, and the newly formed then Department of International Trade, really fascinated me. And when we got to the snap election, I remember I was really desperate to get back onto the International Development Committee, having been elected, because it took me that long, 6 months, to get through the alphabet soup of all the jargon and things like that. And I'd never heard of ICAI before coming into it, but it's been fascinating to actually first serve as a member and then as a chairman, because it does play a really important role. Apart from possibly Stephen, because as chairman, the amount of time he invests in it, in chairing that committee, taking so much on board, the rest of the members, we do our best to get into the depths of what is a huge portfolio around the world, global portfolio around the world, but we can't do everything. And so I always see us as almost the layman scrutinising, whereas ICAI provides that professional impetus. They are the development economists, they are the academics, they are the auditors that can really come in and get down to brass tacks. So when we do our reviews, the wider reviews, we tend to call for evidence. We'll have written evidence, we'll call people in front of us, but again, it's a limited amount of time, whereas ICAI can really do far more visits. They can do the desktop research, and that in itself is incredibly useful and incredibly informative as well for the rest of us. I know that when you look at what that means for other departments, where the increasing amounts of ODA spend is not with DFID, it sits with those other departments. And I know Tamsyn's predecessor, Alison Evans, used to explain when she'd gone to one of those other departments how they felt they'd been ICAI'd. I think it became a verb because they're just not used to that sort of level of scrutiny. But it is an important level of scrutiny, not just for the reasons I've said. But Matthew touched on the media, the 0.7%. If you think about other departments, Department of Education, Department of Health, these kind of areas, pretty well every journalist that has children will know something about schools. They'll know about their own schools. Every journalist goes to uses hospitals, GPs. Not every journalist, not every broadcaster gets in depth about international development. So actually, it takes a journalist or broadcaster to have a particular interest, to want to go out and look at what's happening around the world, whether it's disaster relief, whether it's global poverty that we've been talking about, whether it's climate change, whether it's sexual violence, and all of these kind of areas that are huge, but ultimately, when it comes down to UK media, can be quite niche. So it's very important that we do focus on that. ICAI itself, we've talked about, Matthew mentioned about the red amber and amber green. Funnily enough, because we're quite a consensual committee, although I think we're reasonably tough and firm on our questioning, we do tend to come out with, both on the IDC itself and on ICAI, a good consensus of how to approach these. And so one of the biggest discussions we always have is, do we stick with the red, amber, green, and the traffic lights? And it comes down to as simple as that, because we want to make it as accessible as we can for other people, as Tamsyn was talking about, communicating what we do, having it as accessible for people to come in and get that snapshot. But it is complicated. So there is an argument to say, actually, is that too simplistic? For the reasons that Matthew said, is it just red, amber, green? Do you want to go into a 0 to 10 scale? Whatever. But it needs to be something that means something to DFID so that they can pull out the learning from it. But it also needs to be simple for people to that don't necessarily have that deeper understanding to be able to come and see, okay, fine, these are questions that maybe we need to look into further and scrutinise externally, and all of which is good. It's interesting, just finally, to see where we go over the next few years, because it's right that we actually get the balance between quantity and quality right, because otherwise we can spread ourselves that little bit too thinly. But there has been some really tough ICAI reports, and I think actually it shows the difference between the relationship between ICAI and DFID and ICAI and other parts of government, that some of the toughest reports have been across government spending, particularly the funds, the Prosperity Fund, the Newton Fund, CSSF, and all these kind of areas that have actually attracted the most criticism. I think one of the things that I've done over my short tenure as chairman is to change the dynamic of our committee that reviews the report and listens to the evidence between ICAI and DFID. So instead of having some artificial relationship where ICAI tells us everything that we've just read in the report, and then DFID tells us why, actually, no, we've learnt that bit, but we're brilliant at this. It actually, by bringing them together in one hearing, we have so much more of a dynamic discussion. And I think that learning really does come out of that. Leave it at that.
So Martin, as I said, we're going to reflect a little bit on the wide lessons for this. Obviously, here at the IFG, we are very interested in how independent scrutiny can make government spending, public spending, more effective. What do you think the lessons are we ought to be taking from ICAI as a model?
Well, indeed so. Thank you, Hannah. I'm not going to add anything to my much more expert co-panellists on the issue of aid spending. I think that there are two concepts that come out of all those three remarks, and one can read on ICAI's excellent website and so on, which are on the one hand impact and value for money, and then scrutiny and accountability. And as you said, Matthew, those two concepts are very much related. So I'll say a bit about each of those in turn, and where I think the UK generally is now sitting internationally in its approach to both of those. First of all, impact and value for money. Back in heady days of autumn last year, when we thought there would be a spending review, a 3-year spending review underway by now, how things change, we published a report on the spending review, and one of the main things we said needed to change is a much more focus on the results of spending, not just divvying money out and hoping for the best. In that report, and there's an IFG publication called Performance Tracker, which looks at the relationship between spending and results as well, we've shown how planning in the 2015 spending review was all too often not based on sound assumptions about what value and impact you could get with a given sum of money. And the result, if we look at prisons, social care, many other areas, is services in crisis and emergency cash injections. Not good for services, not good for the Treasury. Of course, a critique like this of the UK system is not new, and governments have repeatedly tried to get to grips with it over the years. I'm even old enough to just about remember the Margaret Thatcher version of this, called the Financial Management Initiative. But in the 1990s, we had the Citizens' Charter. Under New Labour, we had public service agreements, and Michael Barber's powerful central Prime Minister's delivery unit. Attempts of this kind have come and gone, and in particular they rather waned after 2010, when the government and the Treasury were very focused, and very necessarily focused, on bringing down public spending. But there's now acceptance by the Treasury and the Cabinet Office that something important got lost. And the last couple of years ago, it's not being at the forefront of political and public attention for obvious reasons, but if you're a nerdy follower of things like me, you'll see things going on like the promotion of single departmental plans. The Treasury's been developing something with help from Michael Barber called the Public Value Framework. Good thing that the issue has been spotted, but as I pointed out, and I'm rather disappointed of Carlton Gardens' blog last week, the single departmental plans are not yet cutting it, certainly not in the public versions that all of us are allowed to see. Secondly, scrutiny and accountability. We've said that government's own systems for assuring value and impact need to be complemented by accountability and scrutiny outside government, not least by Parliament. Of course, one of Parliament's fundamental historical roles is supply, and going with the authorisation of spending must be a concern for how effectively the money is being spent. And we've heard about that system working well, I think, in relation to one particular area of spending, but we don't have anything like those arrangements for public spending more generally. And it's already been, we've got the Commons Procedure Committee looking at what we might do to address that across the system as a whole. We were pleased to give evidence to that inquiry, and we look forward to their report, which I understand will be out very soon. So both elements of what I've been saying, there's a risk, I think, of the UK falling seriously behind international practice. Around the world, Canada and New South Wales are just two I've been looking at recently. Governments are working hard to get better at making sure spending actually achieves something and demonstrating that, not least driven by politicians, prime ministers and others who invest real time and personal energy into making that happen. Similarly, on parliamentary scrutiny, the OECD's evidence to the Procedure Committee inquiry said that the UK is behind even other Westminster-style democracies now in the extent and quality of its parliamentary budget oversight. Good example of how that can, what sort of improvements can be brought about very quickly. Just 18 months ago, Ireland set up a new budget committee and a parliamentary budget office to support it. And I heard a couple of weeks ago about the really strong impact that committee is already making on the quality of government financial planning, not the policy content, which, like in our system, other committees look after, but the quality of planning and impact. So we at the IFG say the time has definitely come to get serious about impact and value across the whole of spending, and that external scrutiny and parliamentary accountability have a big part to play in that.
Thank you very much, Martin. So, one of the interesting things I think that's come out from a number of the comments is this question about overspend now being channeled through increasingly to other departments, and the question of other problems now feeling they're being ICAI'd. Obviously, ICAI has a role, as an independent body in scrutinising that spend. NAO has a role. I think the NAO's recently said, though, that it doesn't feel it's necessarily clear within government who's taking responsibility for ensuring that spending effectiveness. They can come in from the outside, ICAI can comment, but who within government thinks it's their job to drive that? Matthew, do you have a view on whether it's clear or what the answer should be?
I have a lot of views on that, yes. So I think the starting point, and this may be a shock to some people, but I think it's important to set out that the Department of Development supports the idea of other parts of the British system spending a bit of the aid budget. That's an important starting point. The bit of the aid budget that the rest of the system in total spends is only a quarter of the whole thing. So fully 3/4 of the aid budget is spent by my department. Now, the precise proportions will be one of the issues that will be negotiated and decided in the next spending round. Whatever the proportions are, there needs to be clearly an accounting officer in charge of each particular bit, as well as a system for ensuring the coherence of the whole. On the first of those, there is absolute clarity. The accounting officer is the permanent secretary of the department doing the spending, and everyone knows in any bit of spending who the accounting officer is, and that is, I think, one of the strengths of our system of accountability from permanent secretaries to Parliament. And the second, in other words, ensuring coherence of the whole, there is a system, and it's there's a ministerial committee, and then there is a senior officials version of that committee. The National Audit Office report that you mentioned is the very one that I'm about later today to be giving evidence to the Public Accounts Committee on. And I suspect that there will be questions about whether that current system is strong enough to provide the necessary level of coherence. And I will make the case that we are operating as best we can within the existing system. But if there were to be an improvement in that system, that would be a good thing. That will only come, I think, in the next spending round as part of that negotiation, because I think it's part and parcel of the negotiation about who spends what.
So what do you think, at risk of asking you to preview your comments to the PAC, what is it about the system specifically that needs to be strengthened to make it more?
Well, I think that we are operating as best we can within the existing system, but for instance, other departments are free to decide essentially however they like to spend their parts of the aid budget. There is an overarching aid strategy, and there are individual, if you like, sub-strategies for particular parts of the world or for particular issues. But they can choose either to follow what I would consider the DFID best practice on how to do that, or not. That is their choice. Whereas in the future, I think one could imagine a system that was a little bit clearer about this is the way that one does it if one is spending the aid budget.
Okay. Does that sound like the right answer to you, Tamsyn?
Well, I absolutely agree that we do, at the moment, really have a problem in terms of who is ultimately accountable for ensuring the oversight of all aid spending. So let me explain it. It happens in a very practical way. So I mentioned that we're doing this review of how UK aid learns, and the poor review manager who is doing this review is certainly not happy when I decided to expand it to all departments, which I did because I thought we should start by introducing ourselves with a sort of soft ICAI before we really go for the big one. But it's been, I think, quite an agonising process for all of them. And one of the biggest challenges is who is actually going to provide the management response? Normally we know who we're talking to. We can see that DFID is being sort of active and helpful, but they're also not feeling that it's clearly their responsibility, and it's not clear otherwise. So I think it will be in the end up to the committee to decide who is summoned, but before then we do need an answer from someone. And the review process has been greatly delayed because of all the complications of trying to work out how we run it. So we do see that practical issue, and I think we would rather echo the concerns of the National Audit Office. There is a structure, there's the ministerial committee, there's a senior officials group, but that is not enough for anyone to get firmly to grips with what needs to be done in response to our findings.
I'll just briefly say that I think it's important that whoever does it, when I talked about being ICAI'd, one of the reasons that I think departments felt like that, because they didn't really understand what this small department was doing and what's it got to do with them. And if you have, it will be still 25% of a reasonable budget. So it's a good amount still that's going out to these departments. So whatever structure that we do decide on, these other departments do have to buy into that. They do have to accept that this scrutiny is there, it's important, and it's very relevant. So they do have the same robust questioning and the same level of answers that DFID gives us.
One more for me, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor, so please do have your questions ready. And if you're sitting next door, you'll be able to stick your head through the door and ask your question in time-honoured fashion. Just a question again to Matthew and Paul, really. You have both seen government through different eyes and, in different roles as an MP and a perm sec. Do you think, having experienced sort of the role that ICAI plays, this is something that should be replicated in other departments? Does everybody need an ICAI?
My personal view on that is that I think everyone should ask themselves whether they did an ICAI. I think it's up to them to decide, and I don't know enough about their own particular circumstances, but I would have thought it's, as a minimum, worth having a look at. I think that the introduction of ICAI and the sort of history that Tamsyn cantered us through does demonstrate that in the case of the Department for Development, it's been a wholly good thing, and it has really improved the quality of what we do and how we do it, and our ability to learn, which is one of the things I'm most proud of in the department.
Yeah, I think the balance of Matthew's answer is right in terms of the fact that it should be up to them to decide. I think, as I said in my opening remarks, the fact is that most of the other government departments have enough external input anyway, proactive input. They don't have to call, whereas we often have to call for evidence and then have to make a second call because we're dealing with people right the way across the world. Whereas, as I say, education, you're not going to find it difficult to find a teacher or two who might actually want to have a bit of input, or a teaching body of these kind of groups. So, yeah.
What's your view?
Well, the only thing I would throw into this is talking to permanent secretaries and other senior officials as part of our current work on the impact of spending. That some of the conversations have noted that the department doesn't really have, across the whole of its activities, a comprehensive, well-informed external view of what it's doing. People will mention that, for example, if there's a bit of their activity where there's a good inspectorate that's looking at what's going on, that generates a lot of worthwhile information, which is used in the ways you described, using ICAI's information, Matthew, but that's very partial. So I think there is an appetite for expert-informed scrutiny, but I would agree, if we look at it at a departmental level, just carbon copying ICAI is plainly not the right approach. It should be the departments themselves and the Treasury should think about what is helpful and appropriate in relation to that department.
I should say as well, actually, one thing that, having said that, ICAI does add than the other external scrutiny that I was just talking about, is that because it regulates itself in terms of alongside the committee, what it chooses to look at, and also something that ICAI informed us that we now do as a wider committee is it comes back a year later. So we do a review, it's not just left like that. So actually, thinking about it, if you just did have external reviews from practitioners around ad hoc, then you may lose the learning further down the line.
That's a very good discipline, isn't it? And I think it does come back to the perennial question with parliamentary committees about how much has to be initiated and driven by members of those committees and their expertise and their knowledge, and how much having that sort of external expert input is right and helpful or is inappropriate because that's people other than the MPs driving it. Tamsyn, did you have anything you wanted to add on this, or shall I?
No, I think we should open out.
Let's open up for the question. So we have some roving mics.
Look at that, he's
Please
keen to go.
raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question. Can we start with this lady down here? I'll take groups of 3 and then we'll...
Thanks. I'm Lucy Lake from CAMFED, Campaign for Female Education, and speaking as an organisation that has been ICAI'd on a number of occasions. Tamsyn, you mentioned that ICAI was one of DFID's or the government's well-kept secrets. And I would say that I think DFID has a number of well-kept secrets, and I think ICAI needs to be actually positioned out more globally as a model of best practice of accountability. And I think one way and one lens through which that could be done is in really picking up that issue of accountability. I mean, you mentioned about how ICAI is now doing more to bring through the voices of beneficiaries, those whom UK aid is intended to benefit. And I think that there is an important opportunity there. It was really disappointing last week to see the coverage around UK aid being seen to be exaggerated in terms of the impact that is being had. And so I think there is an opportunity in redefining accountability and for ICAI to be zooming in on the kind of financial and impact data that does allow for us to drill down on what do we mean by accountability to those for whom the aid is intended to serve. Because with that kind of data, we can affect the kind of cost-effectiveness analysis that really does allow us to see, are we getting the most bang for the buck for those who need it most? And that's where I think ICAI really could be positioned as a model of best practice globally, and that we could be doing more in terms of using ICAI to hold others to account beyond the UK. So it's just a plug to say that I think there's a lot more that we could be doing in achieving the value of ICAI.
I'm Billy James. I'm a chartered accountant, and I was recently in Zimbabwe. In countries which are run by highly skilled kleptocrats, where the local government knows where the local auditors live, do you not do an obvious audit test? You know what you've spent each year. You can value and you can count the cost of the bridges you've built, the dams you've built, and other tangible assets that you've financed. Do you then put the intangible balance under the microscope to find out whether it has been skimmed?
Thank you. I'll take one more. Right in the back. So I was just going to the gentleman back in the left. Sorry.
My name is Christopher. I work for the Project on Democracy, which is a think tank that's published a report a couple of years ago on the effectiveness of aid. And my question is, if Matthew Rycroft, you mentioned that DFID had the strongest track record of spending aid effectively of any department, and has more transparency mechanisms in place than any other department. Does that not mean that if we're spending a good quarter of our aid budget through other departments, surely that means that we're getting less transparency and less value for money?
Okay, who'd like to kick off? Tamsyn, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Well, thanks, Lucy, I think it was from CamFed, on ICAI as a global model. We have actually had the French come to talk to us to see if they can set up something similar to ICAI. And there already are some other European examples, although I don't think all of them replicate all of the features. On your point about the voices of those that UK aid is meant to help, this is something that I feel personally very strongly about, even though it makes my life a great deal more complicated and that of the team more complicated as we organise reviews. So to give you examples of the new reviews we're doing and how that works, then we are, for example, in relation to the Ghana portfolio review, getting the views of citizens and not just people who are directly beneficiaries, because we think that will provide a balance to all the other data that we use. And in the case of the prevention of sexual violence review, which Paul alluded to, we're making sure that the voices of survivors are heard, and the ultimate aim of that is that programmes themselves will be informed by those voices. So we hope to facilitate that. But in terms of the sort of details of results, something that I hope to continue that my predecessor Alison started is what she called impact reviews or results reviews, which really interrogate the methodology for the claims as to the results achieved. And that's something that I think we will do at least once a year as a focus of our review. So just as I was arriving, there was a lively debate going on Twitter between DFID and ourselves because we weren't happy that they'd used the right methodology for the number of lives saved in the maternal health context, just to give you an idea. So I basically agree with that, and if you see our follow-up review, you'll see there's quite a lot of that, which hopefully does allow for others to use our reports to hold government accountable. I'm not sure if I can answer, I think it was Billy's question about beyond infrastructure and the intangible balance. I mean, others from ICAI may know whether we specifically looked at Zimbabwe recently. I can certainly reassure you that we don't confine our scrutiny to infrastructure spending, but look very broadly across the piece. But Matthew may be able to say more. And on the question about other government departments and value for money, I think it's fair to say, but I would love my fellow commissioners who have seen this over the 4 years to speak up on this. That yes, if you look just on average, there have been bigger questions about value for money because of what I explained, this sort of very quick scale up before the systems were in place. I mean, having said that, we do also have some good examples of good value for money using the expertise of the Department for Health and Social Care in relation to the global health threats is one example, and in relation to the International Climate Fund, where I think we were more positive about BASE than DFIDs in the case of that one. So it's not a completely straightforward picture, I would say.
Just going in reverse then, Christopher, I think you're right that we want more transparency. That doesn't necessarily follow that it's not value for money, but it's only by throwing sunlight on it that we'll find that out, that for sure. And I think hopefully if we can get the structures in place that we were talking about, we can. I'm sure those departments will eventually welcome it, shall we say. Billy, to answer your question about corruption, don't know about Zimbabwe in particular, but obviously we stopped budget support some years ago to try and get past those kleptocratic governments. But nonetheless, as you say, any sense of skimming probably will be best answered by Matthew or someone within the department. It was interesting though, when I was up in Scotland at the DFID office there was a specific department that tackles corruption. So interesting that it's called, for those of you that are thick of it enthusiasts, it's called GOSAC, which sounds a little bit familiar, you might remember. But also, but Lucy, you talked about the best kept secrets. And I think actually this is something that I was talking about the media before. It always worries me about the international development community that they are always on the defensive about the 0.7%. It's something we always must talk about, we must celebrate, and we must actually talk about what we are doing for around the world to tackle global poverty, but also to actually help citizens here as a result of what we're doing, not just making them feel better, but talking about security, talking about immigration at source, talking about drug-resistant diseases and these kind of things, that we have a good news story to tell about UK aid. So we can also always sometimes get on the defensive, and I worry that sometimes if we are therefore throwing up accountability, some people may fear that actually throws up the negative stories that certain newspapers can pick up on. And but I don't think that should stop us from having that accountability, from actually making sure that we are seeing the best value for money as possible.
Matthew, it would be good if you could pick that point up as well, if you're going to address those, because obviously part of the point of ICAI was to make to push to analyse this question of whether 0.7% was the right answer, which was getting a lot of questioning. So do you think that's made an appreciable difference having ICAI?
Yeah. Panels usually work best when there's a bit of tension between the members, but actually I totally agree with what Tamsyn Barton just said, so sorry to disappoint you on that. I mean, I very much agree with what Tamsyn was saying in answer to Lucy's question about best kept secrets. I think that all of us have a responsibility actually to be even more out there to explain to people how their taxes are being spent. And what a strong track record we've got, and it's not perfect, and we're operating in very difficult environments. And as Christopher said, as Billy said, there are very significant corruption risks in many of the countries that we're operating in. There's also a very difficult security environment increasingly in our countries, because there is an increasing correlation between people living in poverty and people living in conflict-affected states. So it's very difficult to do this work, but we are absolutely determined to do it, and absolutely to get out there with ICAI, with the IGC, with others, to tell the story. And we want to be globally leading. We want to be being influential, not just in our own country, but over other donors who we work very closely with, and others in the sector, whether that's parts of the private sector who are interested in this sort of impact investing, with NGOs, charities, civil society organisations, with philanthropists, and with everyone else. As others have said, I mean, there is a significant risk of skimming, as Billy put it, of corruption in many parts of the world that DFID operates in, and we have significant procedures in place to reduce to a minimum those losses, and we go after every allegation of fraud with a dedicated team very assiduously. And we seek to design our programs from the beginning to allow us to have a very high degree of oversight, however the delivery of each program is being done. And then finally, just to pick up the transparency aspect of Christopher's question, I'm very proud of the fact that DFID scores so well on transparency, with third out of all the donors in the world on the last transparency index. And that's a great place to be. Obviously, first or second would be even better, but we will aspire to that next year. But we are well ahead, if you like, of other bits of the British system. And we will therefore carry on doing what we're doing and to provide the tools to them so that they can use our approaches if they so wish.
Just a couple of quick points, Hannah. First of all, on your point, Christopher, I think what you are saying, the point it makes to me is that we've got a department that's performing very strongly on transparency in one very particular area of public spending, but we don't have that to nearly the same extent elsewhere, even to the extent that government refuses to publish in full the single departmental plans that set out what departments are planning to do with the money. So we need more transparency across the system. Your point, Lucy, about user voice, I think one of the arguments for independent evidence institutions is absolutely they can bring that kind of evidence to bear alongside others. And I know that before I started here, one of the things I was doing was designing and managing a research program. And it was incredibly powerful to bring qualitative research into users' experiences and opinions alongside a lot of number crunching, looking at spending and other kinds of data, and the two kinds of analysis done well can support each other very strongly. The problem is, as I know from the hours we spent thinking about the methodology for the user voice, that it's incredibly easy to do it incredibly badly and in ways that give you false readings. So I definitely agree that institutions of this kind should be bringing user voice in, and they can bring the professionalism that makes sure that user voice is interpreted in a reliable way.
Okay, I think we'll take another set of questions. Is one over here, please? Lady in the
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jessica Toll. I wanted to turn the lens on its head a little bit and perhaps ask Martin. Tamsyn mentioned good practice in the Climate Fund and health, but I wondered if there was anything from your spending review work or research that you'd learned from other government departments about impact and value for money, which DFID could perhaps learn from.
Stuart Britton, Health Prom. I want to ask why, given that there has been admission so far from the panel that that government money goes astray in countries that do not have the institutions to manage it. And I work in Afghanistan, where much money does go astray. I want to ask why DFID does not instead allocate more funds for spending through international NGOs, where it quite rightly accounts for the spending of every pound. Instead, in Afghanistan, DFID allocates most of its money to the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is managed by the World Bank, supposedly managed, but because the sums are huge and the government institutions are poor, much of it gets lost. Now, this, to my mind, is a needless loss of money. In this current UKAID direct funding round, I know from BOND, the British Overseas Network for Development, that it only expects to fund about 5% of the 1,100 applications. Now, At that rate, it is simply not worth the time of small NGOs to apply. It's a waste of time and money, whereas money is being wasted much worse in fragile states that don't have institutions to manage it and account.
Thank you.
And then there's just one on the aisle at the back.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm a journalist and I'm used to international aid being a source of some often quite ridiculous story and embarrassing stories to the government. And I think I wanted to put forward a suggestion that international aid is quite unique as a department in that it doesn't regard the UK taxpayer as the customer. I wonder if that change might have an effect on the way that money is spent, because a lot of people outside of the Westminster bubble regard international aid as one of the clearest manifestations of the Westminster bubble. And not everyone out in the wider world, is a bigot or is against international aid. I think a stronger connection between the department and wider public opinion might just produce a more refined set of priorities.
Thank you. Martin, do you want to start with a question about what...
Can I ask just where you're from? Which?
Well, I'm a researcher now. I'm a
Researcher.
journalist by training,
Yeah.
but independent researcher.
Cool.
Martin, what have we learned from other departments which DFID might find useful to think about in terms of impact, if anything?
Well, I'm afraid I was rather struggling because actually the picture we have here is a much stronger and more systematic picture than I think I've come across anywhere else in the system. An example of that is interviewing a director of analysis who'd recently moved from one department to another. In his previous department, he had developed a strong impact model for how the different bits of departmental activity and spending led to outcomes. Moving to another department, was surprised and disconcerted that department, better remain nameless, but a major public service department, domestic public service department, did not have any kind of analytical model for how the various activities and funding streams that it presides over produce results. So I'm afraid that's a bit of an anti-model. I think, I know that MHCLG over the last couple of years, unsurprisingly in view of mounting political concern about housing, put a lot of effort and energy into understanding how different interventions lead to results for the government in the housing market. And it may be no coincidence that housing supply was one of the issues where, when we went around talking to people more on the front line of public service delivery, they said they felt that the government had made most progress in the last couple of years in establishing a clear framework for turning public money into results in terms of brick being laid upon brick.
Matthew, do you want to tackle this question of whether DFID thinks of the UK citizen as a customer?
Yes, I mean, what's your name? David. I think David's question in a way is an even better answer to the previous one than the one I tried to give. But I very strongly believe, and let me repeat, that all of us in this world, including in DFID, have a duty, have a responsibility to get out there and explain to the UK taxpayer what is happening with their taxes. So in that sense, absolutely, we in the department see the UK taxpayer as our customer. We have created, as Stuart was saying, this aid match scheme, which has some disbenefits, but the massive benefit that it has is that it connects British members of the public with the choice about how a bit of the aid budget gets spent, and we're planning to carry on doing that. And when I mean, I'm trying to play my part in a small way, getting out and about. I was in Belfast a couple of weeks ago, for instance, not talking about Northern Ireland, but talking about international development with people who happen to be in and from Northern Ireland, of which there are many outstanding NGOs. That was a very heartening trip because you could see that there were many people a long way from the Westminster bubble, as you put it, who believe passionately in this work and who are very valued partners of ours. So I think we've got it in terms of the need to do it, and we are seeking to step up. And I think all of us can come together and try to do even more on that. Certainly hope so. Should I just briefly answer the other question? I mean, I went on to Jessica's question, but I'll suffice to say that I think there are lots of examples where DFID is working with others, in fact, it's pretty hard to think of an example where we are operating solely on our own. I was in Mozambique last week, and the outstanding work that we did, and I accept DFID led it, but it wouldn't have been possible to do that cyclone response were it not for a strong FCO presence, for Public Health England, and I'm sure lots of other people as well. So I think there are countless examples where it's the combination of different organisations, including my department, but many others as well, that really gives the UK our unique offer. And then finally, there were several aspects to Stuart's question, but I think I just want to underline that strengthening institutions of countries like Afghanistan is itself a purpose of much of our aid spending. I accept that institutions are very weak in many parts of the world, and we have a job to do, all of us, to help strengthen them. But if we only pursue one particular type of delivery model, we are unlikely to be making the maximum impact that we can at scale. And while there are, I think you're making the case for doing even more with small NGOs rather than with the big international ones, and still less the big multilateral organisations. Well, I think the World Bank has a very strong track record of providing funding at scale, operating as DFID in some of the hardest parts of the world, and putting in place mechanisms to ensure that that they get maximum value and maximum impact for that money. And we are proud to partner with them in Afghanistan and many other parts of the world. We are seeking to do more with local NGOs, but that isn't always the right answer, and it's very, very rarely the only right answer.
I'd say to Jessica, I can't answer your question about other departments, but I can say that actually, funny enough, from the scrutiny point of view, our clerks rotate regularly as well, so from one department to another. So we get a sense of shared learning. I'm hoping departments do as well in that regard. I think Matthew was right when talking about the fact that what Stuart was talking about Afghanistan, the need to, it's something that I've always looked at, and the committee has as well, the need to look at NGOs, but in particular the ability for smaller NGOs to get involved in some of these countries because they can deliver at lower cost and a greater localised need as well. The problem with that, of course, is that in order to have that ethos within the department, you probably need a bigger department. You need more staff within the department to be able to manage those contracts, which then gets to David's point about the outside the Westminster bubble. I was door knocking just yesterday and had a chat after he talked to me about Brexit. He was saying, well, what about the international development budget then? And the problem you have when you're talking about this, it comes back to what I was saying about defending the budget, not just defending it, but promoting it, is charity begins at home is 4 simple words. It's a really good attack line, frankly. And so when you're trying to explain it from UK PLC, from a taxpayer's point of view, the fact that you can talk about, as I said, about security issues, you can talk about immigration issues. When we had the political wrangle over Syria, for example, the argument was made that you can either bring 20,000 people over here, or for the same cost, you can treat 800,000 people around in the camps around that area. You choose which 20,000 people aren't going to get that, or 780,000 people aren't going to get that treatment. The fact that Oliver Cromwell died of malaria, so we have had malaria in this country, we don't want it back, and the more drug resistant it gets, it will come back. It's these kind of fundamental things that, because people just look at charity begins at home, they don't bother poking in behind the headlines, you can get a tabloid headline and just sort of like, okay, fine, well, that's because that child isn't getting that treatment, this child isn't getting that education. It's a really difficult attack line to defend, but defend it we must.
Tamsyn, what do you think ICAI's role is in this bigger, wider debate?
Well, I think that our role is fundamental in relation to taxpayers, and that's what we were set up for. And so I think we're an important part of that jigsaw. At the same moment as the decision to spend a lot more of taxpayers' money, it was obviously the moment to ensure that taxpayers could get information about what was happening. So I certainly think, as far as we're concerned, this is a completely crucial role. And if we ever lose sight of it because we're having very specialist debates, because there are a lot of experts in ICAI, we're constantly reminded by Paul, as you can hear, that we need to have that consciousness of what how it's going to go down here back home. So that keeps our feet on the ground. I just did also want to pick up the debate on corruption, stronger institutions and different delivery models, because that is something on which ICAI has had quite a bit to say over time, and it is a very difficult balance. I did actually briefly touch on it in relation to health. So the risks where you substitute delivery through government systems entirely with parallel systems is that you weaken them, and then you may gain in terms of immediate health results, but over the longer term you lose. And so that is the dilemma, which is particularly acute in fragile states. But I think it is arguable that you need to do both. And if you are going a government route, I think civil society has a hugely important role beyond delivery, which is helping the people who are receiving the services to hold the providers to account and put the pressure on in order to create that virtuous circle, which is the only way that services will ultimately improve.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to take 2 final questions. There's a gentleman at the back, Freddie.
Bruce Lloyd, I wonder whether the panel would feel that our national security would actually increase over the longer term if the aid budget and the defence budget were reversed. Connected with that, I wonder if there's an impact analysis on the Trident missile programme.
And one final question then.
Kind of just off the back of that question, and also what you said earlier, Matthew, about the future of the 0.7. From the S&P Central Research. You seem quite sort of sure that the 0.7% commitment will be renewed in future, but we've kind of seen even now, and also in the public, and there's sort of significant political and public will not to do so, whether it's Priti Patel as the new Secretary of State or Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. And could you perhaps speak a little bit about what you think the future will be of DFID itself, whether it's rolled in, whether its spending is sort of merged there, and of the 0.7% commitment?
And I think that's an interesting wider question about sort of these sorts of spending targets and what impact they then have on the case of certain sorts of spending. Do you want to kick us off?
So do that. Well, thanks for those final questions and for all of them. They've been really great set of questions and an engaged audience. So on the defence budget and the aid budget, I mean, I'm not going to make the case for reversing it, but I do think that them operating sort of together and in sync and in a fusion way is the right way to think about this, so that the 2% of defence and 0.7% of international development adds up, if anything, to even more than 2.7%. I think that is a very valuable way to think about it. I think everything that we seek to do from the Department of Development is about joining up so that we can get win-wins, so that benefit both our department's objectives as well as the objectives of others, including the Ministry of Defence. Of course, Penny Mordaunt went from being my Secretary of State to being Defence Secretary, so there's actually probably more joint work between DFID and MOD than you might expect. And then on the 0.7% and the future of the department, I mean, there doesn't need to be a renewal of 0.7% because it's legislated for, so that's set, and if anyone wanted to change it, they would have to muster a majority in the House of Commons for that, and that majority subject to Paul's greater insights, does not exist. So it's going to continue, as I said. The main parties continue to support it, and it's our job to make that support as grand as possible and to get maximum impact with that. It's a huge amount of money, £14 billion each year, and that's a big responsibility. It's also a big part of our role in the world. And post-Brexit, we need to be thinking about global Britain. We need to be thinking about what do we stand for as a country. We need to think about what are we good at as a country. And it is very interesting that in the rest of the world, they see the UK and DFID as world leading on international development. It's only back here that there is this sense of fragility and unself-confidence. But around the world, people see what we, the UK, are doing, and they see it making a very significant difference indeed. And finally, the government's policy at the moment is to have a separate, standalone, independent Department for International Development, and that's been the policy since 1997. It's one I think that adds to that standing that I was just talking about. If there were ever to be a change, I don't think there will be imminently, but obviously we need to be ready for all scenarios. If there were to be a change, we would make that change happen, and if there isn't a change, we will crack on with the job at hand.
In terms of the defence budget, actually, it's interesting when you get the synergies, as you say, especially around the British overseas territories, when we were arguing about whether ODA money could be used in the disasters over there, because it was obviously our armed forces that were often first on the scene in that sort of disaster relief scenario in particular. In terms of I've said quite a bit about the 0.7%, but I think what we do have to, I wouldn't want to change it, and as Matthew said, I don't see there being a majority in Parliament to change it, so I don't think, I would be surprised if anyone proposed that. What you can always do is look to make sure it's spent, as every Secretary of State said, the best way possible. What we've got to make sure that we don't ever do as a department is to shovel the money out the door come to the end of the financial year. That's always the worry about those sort of things. So we've got to look at ways to make sure that's not happening now, make sure it doesn't happen in the future. In terms of the departments, there's good reason I didn't go. I was one of the few Tory MPs not to go for leader, so I don't have to make that decision. But nonetheless, I think we've got the balance about right now where we've got shared ministers. So the departments are discrete, but the ministers are shared, so they've got that far closer relationship, so that the discussions can be closer.
Bruce's point about defence and aid, I won't get into that specifically, but I think the question it raises for me is that often when we're thinking about questions of impact, they don't fit neatly into departmental boxes, and that would apply very much to a lot of domestic issues. For example, the life chances of children growing up in vulnerable households. The government wants to improve those life chances, but lots of different departments have to contribute to that. And I think the learning from that is that impact can't be considered neatly in departmental boxes. As we see in the ODA world and with ICAI, it's really important to be looking at the whole of what the government does, and with some consistency of systems and evidence to do that.
Thank you. Tamsyn, the final word.
Final words. Just a couple of things from the ICAI position. In relation to the defence budget and the aid budget, of course, I don't have any general level comments. I would just take the opportunity to highlight we're doing our first review, which involves scrutinising MOD use of aid in the prevention of sexual violence and sexual exploitation of abuse by peacekeepers. I've just come back from seeing some of the work being done in Nairobi, so look out for that. But to finish with the general point in relation to machinery of government changes, I basically would echo what Martin says. From our perspective, wherever aid is spent, you're going to need proper scrutiny of that aid for all the reasons that Paul has set out and David, the journalist, reminded us. It's absolutely vital that taxpayers can have the reassurance, and also those who ultimately are meant to benefit from the aid can ensure that voices are heard and that aid is improved.
Great. Well, I think I'd like to thank ICAI for developing this event with us. I think it's been proven to be really